In the 25th chapter of the book of Leviticus, God gives Moses what is perhaps the most economically radical instruction in the Bible. Every 7 years the land shall rest. No sowing, no pruning, no harvesting. A Sabbath for the soil. And every 7 cycles of 7, every 49th year, followed by the 50th, something more sweeping occurs. The 50th year shall be as a jubilee. On the Day of Atonement, the ram's horn is blown throughout the land. And what is announced is this: proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. All debts are cancelled. All slaves and bonded laborers are freed. All land that has been sold returns to the family that originally held it. Everything resets. Today, we read the Year of the Jubilee with Erich Fromm, who saw in this ancient institution not a curiosity of ancient Israelite law, but one of the most penetrating critiques of the human tendency to confuse what we own with who we are. Fromm's distinction between the having mode and the being mode, developed most fully in his 1976 book, To Have or To Be, is one of the central ideas in the whole of his work. The having mode is the orientation towards existence in which what matters is what I possess, my property, my status, my accumulated goods, my knowledge as stored information, my identity as constituted by what I can claim as mine. The being mode is the orientation in which what matters is who I am in the act of living, my relationships, my creativity, my capacity for love and work, and my aliveness to the present moment. Fromm was clear that the having mode is not simply greed in the vulgar sense. It is a deeply rooted existential strategy, a way of managing the fundamental insecurity of human existence by accumulating what cannot be taken away. If I have enough, perhaps I am safe. If my ownership is secure, perhaps I am real. The problem, as Fromm saw it, is that this strategy is self-defeating at a fundamental level. What I have can always be lost. The more my identity is constituted by what I possess, the more fragile my sense of self becomes, because possession is always threatened. The person who lives entirely in the having mode is never secure, because security in the having mode requires more having and more and more. The Jubilee is, in Fromm's reading, a structural remedy for the pathology of having, because the Jubilee does not rely on individual generosity, or on the virtue of the wealthy, or on the conscience of the creditor. It is built into the structure of the system. Every 50 years, the accumulation resets. The land, which in the ancient Israelite context is the primary form of wealth, cannot be permanently alienated. It can be sold, yes, but only until the next Jubilee. What is actually sold is not the land itself, but the number of harvests remaining before the reset. The underlying ownership, the family's covenant claim to the land, is inalienable. This means that extreme permanent inequality cannot accumulate. A family that falls into debt may lose the use of their land for a generation, but not forever. The system has a correction built into it. Fromm saw in this a recognition, intuitive perhaps but profound, that absolute private property is not a natural or inevitable arrangement. It is a social choice. And like all social choices, it has consequences for the human beings who live within it. A world in which poverty can become permanent, in which debt can be inherited, in which the dispossession of one generation becomes the permanent condition of its descendants, is a world that generates a particular kind of human psychology, the psychology of the trapped, of those who have nothing left to lose, and of those so consumed by the protection of their abundance that generosity is experienced as threat. There is a specific instruction in the Jubilee text that Fromm would find most significant. God says to the Israelites, "The land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. With me you are but aliens and tenants." You are tenants, not owners. Even at the height of your prosperity, with the land producing abundantly and your storehouses full, you are tenants. The ultimate ownership is not yours, and the Jubilee is the moment when this is made structurally visible. Fromm understood this as a radical challenge to what he called idolatry in the extended sense, not the worship of literal statues, but the projection of human powers onto created things. When a person's sense of self becomes wholly constituted by their property, when they can no longer distinguish between who they are and what they have, in Fromm's analysis, made an idol of their possessions, and the idolater, as the prophets understood, becomes less alive, less human, less free in proportion to their devotion. The Jubilee interrupts this devotion by force. Whatever you have built up, whatever sense of permanence and security and identity you have constructed out of accumulated ownership, the Jubilee reminds you the land is not finally yours. The horn sounds and the calculation resets. The Jubilee also addresses the liberation of bonded laborers. Israelites who had fallen into debt could be compelled to work for their creditors, not as permanent slaves in the absolute sense, but as bonded servants for the duration of the debt. The Jubilee releases them. And here, Fromm would hear an echo of the founding story. God says, "For they are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves." The release from Egypt, the paradigmatic act of liberation in the whole of the Hebrew Bible, echoes into every Jubilee. You were slaves, and I freed you. Therefore, you may not permanently enslave one another. The memory of servitude is the ground of the social obligation towards freedom. Fromm wrote extensively about what he called the escape from freedom, the deeply human tendency, when confronted with the anxiety of genuine autonomy, to surrender freedom back to a structure that will provide security in exchange for submission. The person who has never been free does not know what they are surrendering, but the person who has been liberated, who has walked out of Egypt, who has crossed the Red Sea, that person knows. And the Jubilee is the institutional memory of that knowing, the recurring reminder that freedom is not a one-time event, but a condition that must be structurally maintained. The Jubilee, as far as historians can tell, may never have been fully implemented as described. It remains in many ways a utopian vision, a command that the social order could not fully absorb. But Fromm would say that is exactly the point. The prophetic tradition within the Hebrew Bible is not primarily a tradition of describing things as they are. It is a tradition of naming what human society should look like if it were organized around the genuine flourishing of human beings rather than the protection of accumulated advantage. The Jubilee names something real, that a world in which extreme inequality is permanent is a world that does damage to human souls, that the person who has everything has a problem as surely as the person who has nothing, that the health of the community depends on not just individual virtue, but on the structures within which individual lives are lived. Proclaim liberty throughout the land. The ram's horn sounds, and for a moment, at least in the imagination of the text, the world that was resets into the world that should be.